Welcome to While We Were Distracted, the podcast where we explore topics that often get overshadowed in the rush of daily life. Please take a moment to like and subscribe, it really helps.
All right, so today we're diving into some pretty heavy stuff. We're going to be talking about NATO, but not the usual headlines. We're going deeper. We're looking at a speech by economist Jeffrey Sachs and his take on the Ukraine war and NATO's role in all of this. Well, let's just say, it's not the story you usually hear. I was actually pretty surprised by some of this, to be honest.
Yeah, it definitely challenges a lot of the common assumptions, for sure, which I think is why it's important for us to unpack it.
For sure. So Sachs's main point, he's saying that this war in Ukraine is not just some sudden move by Putin, right? He argues that the roots of this go way back to the early 90s. And these broken promises about NATO expansion, he thinks that's a huge part of how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, he really emphasizes that point, this idea that the U.S. kept pushing to expand NATO eastward. Even though they had basically assured Russia that wouldn't happen, Sachs argues that this constant push eastward, that's what really escalated tensions and led us to where we are now.
Right, and there's this one quote that Sachs uses from James Baker III, talking to Gorbachev back in 1990. And Baker just straight up says, NATO will not move 1 inch eastward if you agree to German unification.
Whoa, right, that sounds like a pretty clear promise.
It does, yeah. And Sachs points out that the Clinton administration basically went back on that promise just a few years later. Starting in 94, they start pushing for expansion. And by 99, you've got Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic all joining NATO.
Wow. And that's just the beginning, right? Sachs lays out this whole chain of events that, from Russia's point of view, looked like a deliberate attempt to box them in.
Exactly. He talks about the bombing of Serbia in 1999, which was a NATO operation. He says that was a real turning point for Russia. They saw it as aggressive and a sign of things to come. Then in 2002, the U.S. pulls out of the anti-ballistic missile treaty.
Oh, right, that treaty. What was the fallout from that again?
Well, it allowed the U.S. to start putting missile defense systems in Eastern Europe. And of
Yeah.
course, Russia saw that as a direct threat. I mean, those missiles could theoretically be used against them. Right, of course. It's like every time Russia tried to open a window, NATO would just slam it shut. At least that's how Sachs is framing it.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And he goes even further. Sachs brings up U.S. involvement in what he calls soft regime change attempts in Ukraine, specifically in 2004 and 2014.
Okay, so he's saying that the U.S. was meddling in Ukrainian politics, trying to get leaders who were more friendly to the West.
That's exactly what he's arguing.
Yeah.
And he presents evidence of U.S. involvement in the overthrow of Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych in 2014. It's all very complex. But the main point is that these events just further increase tensions with Russia.
And of course, you can't forget that Putin was basically begging the West to halt NATO expansion for years. He even proposed a draft security agreement in December 2021, trying to get something in writing to stop this eastward creep of NATO.
Yeah, and that draft agreement was basically ignored by the West, which, according to Sachs, was a major missed opportunity for some diplomacy.
It sounds like it. Okay, so we've got this backdrop of broken promises
Yeah.
and these escalating tensions. But how does NATO's original purpose factor into all of this? Like, what was the whole point of NATO in the first place?
Right, so back in 1949, NATO was created as this pact for collective defense. Basically, the idea was that if one member was attacked, all the other members would come to its aid. So it was basically a way to counter the Soviet Union and prevent another world war.
Okay, right. The whole an attack on one is an attack on all thing.
Yeah.
But then the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. So what happened to NATO after that? Did it just become irrelevant?
Well, that's a great question. A lot of people thought it should have been disbanded, or at least drastically reformed. I mean, the enemy it was created to fight no longer existed.
But it didn't disappear, did it?
Nope. Instead of winding down, NATO started expanding. And that's where the problems really start, according to Sachs. Russia saw this expansion as a direct threat, a betrayal of the promises made after the Cold War. They felt like they were being encircled.
So even though NATO kept saying it was purely defensive, Russia just didn't buy it.
Not really. And it's important to understand why. Imagine you're Russia. You see this military alliance, originally created to oppose you, steadily moving closer and closer to your borders. You're going to feel threatened no matter what they say their intentions are.
Right, right. It's almost like they were speaking different languages. NATO talking about collective defense, and Russia hearing, "We're coming for you."
Exactly. And this communication breakdown, combined with all this historical baggage, it created a situation ripe for misunderstanding and mistrust.
And that brings us back to Sachs's call for a more holistic solution. He's basically saying that this whole conflict in Ukraine, it's shown us how outdated and inadequate NATO is for dealing with the world today.
Yeah, he even argues that the NATO Charter itself, which is over 70 years old now, is part of the problem. It makes it really difficult for countries to leave NATO, even if they wanted to.
So even if we wanted to totally rethink how we approach global security, we're kind of stuck with this Cold War relic.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. And it's one of the reasons Sachs is calling for such a fundamental rethink. He argues that we need a new security architecture that can address the complexities of the 21st century, not just rehash the old Cold War playbook.
So
He makes a really interesting point about how the way we view security itself needs to change. It's not just about military alliances and deterrence anymore.
So what's he suggesting? Like, what would this new security architecture even look like?
Well, he's not saying he have all the answers right now. It's more about acknowledging that the old systems aren't working and being open to exploring totally new approaches.
Okay, so less about drawing up blueprints and more about starting the conversation. But if NATO is off the table, what are we even talking about? What are the alternatives?
Well, there are a few ideas floating around. One is to beef up existing organizations like the United Nations, give them more power and resources to actually deal with global threats, and,
Yeah,
help resolve conflict.
that makes sense.
Yeah.
So instead of relying on this one regional alliance, we'd be looking to a more global, inclusive organization, kind of like shifting from a neighborhood watch to a global peacekeeping force.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Of course, the UN has its own issues, but it's a starting point. Another option is to create new regional security forums that include everyone involved, not just the usual Western allies.
So bring everyone to the table, even countries that haven't always seen eye to eye. It sounds ambitious, to say the least.
Ambitious, yes, but think about it. What if you had a forum where Russia, China, the US, and other major players could actually sit down and hash out their security concerns together?
That would definitely be a different kind of conversation than what's happening now.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe that's exactly what we need, a space where dialogue is possible, where countries can start to build trust and understand each other's perspectives.
Yeah, I like that. Sachs definitely seems to think that dialogue is key here. It's like he's saying, hey, we messed up by not taking Russia's concerns seriously. Now we need to actually listen and find a way forward together.
Yeah, that's a big part of his message, and it's resonating with a lot of people. There's a growing sense that the old ways of doing things, this constant focus on military might and confrontation, it's just leading to more conflict and instability.
Right. So what would a more cooperative approach to security actually look like on the ground? What concrete steps could we take to get there?
Well, first and foremost, we need to actually engage in serious, sustained diplomacy with countries that we currently see as adversaries, like Russia and China. We need to understand their perspectives, their fears, their goals, and find areas of common ground.
That's easier said than done, right? Especially now. With relations between the West and Russia at an all-time low, it's hard to imagine just sitting down for a friendly chat after everything that's happened.
It's definitely not going to be easy, and it'll require a major shift in mindset on both sides. But it's not impossible. It starts with acknowledging that security is not a zero-sum game. One country's gain doesn't have to be another's loss.
Right. More like a rising tide lifts all boats. Maybe that's a bit cheesy, but you get the idea.
Exactly. And maybe a little cheese is what we need right now to break the tension. But seriously, it's about recognizing that we're all in this together. Global security is a shared responsibility.
Sachs argues that this is where NATO falls short, right? It's a tool built for a different time, a different set of problems. It's like trying to fix a computer with a hammer.
Yeah, that's a pretty apt analogy. We need new tools, new approaches, new ways of thinking about security in the 21st century.
So what would a world without NATO, or at least a radically reformed NATO, actually look like? Would it be more peaceful, more stable, or would it just descend into chaos?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? No one knows for sure. Any alternative will come with its own risks and challenges, but one thing's for sure.
Hit me with it.
We can't just keep doing what we've been doing. The current system clearly isn't working. Yeah, it feels like we're at this crossroads. We can either cling to these old ways, right? Hope that somehow they'll magically start working again. Or we can take this leap of faith and try something new.
It rests his perspective. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes those leaps of faith are necessary. It's like he's saying, hey, the map we've been using, it's outdated. Time to draw a new one.
Exactly.
So let's talk about that new map. What are the biggest obstacles to actually creating a new security architecture? Is it just a matter of getting everyone to agree? Or are there, like, deeper, more fundamental challenges?
Well, getting everyone to agree, that in itself is a huge hurdle, right? You've got all these countries, different histories, different ideologies, different interests, all trying to figure out how to coexist peacefully. It's like
Mhm.
trying to herd cats, but on a global scale.
And those cats all have nuclear weapons.
Exactly, which adds a certain level of urgency to the situation, wouldn't you say?
For sure.
But even beyond those political challenges, there are some really fundamental questions that need to be answered.
Like what?
Well, for starters, what are the core principles of this new system? What are we actually trying to achieve? Is it simply the absence of war? Or is it something more ambitious than that?
Like global cooperation,
Hmm.
or a system that actually addresses the root causes of conflict,
Yeah.
not just the symptoms.
Exactly. Those are the kinds of questions we need to be asking. And then there's the question of enforcement. If we create this new system, how do we make sure everyone plays by the rules? What happens when someone breaks those rules?
Right. That's the age-old problem, isn't it? Who watches the watchman? But let's be optimistic for a moment. Let's say we actually do manage to overcome these challenges. What might this new security architecture actually look like in practice?
Well, it's impossible to say for sure, but some ideas that have been floated around. Strengthening international law and institutions, creating new mechanisms for conflict resolution, and even establishing a global peacekeeping force.
A global peacekeeping force. Okay, now that's an interesting idea. Would it be like a UN army on steroids? Or something totally different?
Yeah, it'd have to be something carefully designed, for sure, to avoid the pitfalls of past interventions. Maybe it would focus more on preventing conflict, rather than intervening in ongoing wars. Maybe it would be composed of troops from a wide range of countries, not just the usual suspects.
It's like we're brainstorming a whole new world order here, aren't we?
Mm.
Pretty heady stuff.
It is, but it's also incredibly important. The choices we make now, the conversations we have, the ideas we explore, they could have a profound impact on the future.
And that's what I think is so exciting about this whole deep dive.
Yeah.
It's not just about understanding the past, it's about imagining the future. It's about recognizing that we have agency, that we're not just passengers on this runaway train.
Exactly. We have the power to choose a different path, to create a world that's more peaceful, more just, and more sustainable. But it requires us to step outside our comfort zones, to challenge our assumptions,
Yeah.
and be open to these new ideas. It really does.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a pretty good note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground today.
Mm.
From the history of NATO and those broken promises that kind of led to the current crisis, to the need for this new security architecture and the challenges of actually creating it.
It has been a thought-provoking conversation, and
Yeah.
hopefully it sparks some ideas for our listeners as well.
I hope so. So to wrap things up, we want to leave you with this question. What do you think the future of global security should look like? What role, if any, should NATO play in that future? And what are you willing to do to create a more peaceful world? These are questions worth pondering, debating, and ultimately acting upon.
Feel free to comment your thoughts or where you would like the conversation to go in a future cast. Please take a moment to like and subscribe. It really helps.